Then Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age."
Well, we are in our Design for Discipleship series, and we have been walking through what it looks like to be a disciple of Jesus. And a few other things that we've been looking at as well are things like spiritual formation, how we are formed in the way of Jesus. And really the question we should be asking ourselves isn't are we disciples of Jesus, but who or what is discipling us? In other words, who or what are we following, or what are we apprenticing under? What we are realizing is that as we follow someone or something, we become like those things. As we disciple under or apprentice under people or things, we become like those things or people. All of humanity is designed to be disciples. It's a human thing, and we need to be aware of that and cognizant of it as we evaluate and reflect on who we are. And this is really what this whole series is about, and how we, by determining who the type of person we will be or are becoming, is often tied to who we are following, and our really purpose of following Jesus. A key aspect of that is to become like him and be a person who reflects him. And if you're listening right now, if you're here, you obviously want to be a part of that. You know, I think if you're here and you got out of bed this morning, maybe didn't sleep very well like I did last night, and you kind of had to drag yourself in this morning, you know, you're here because you want to earnestly and sincerely follow Jesus. For some of you, you might just be curious. You might be curious about this Jesus person. You might be thinking, well, the other stuff I've been doing the rest of my life isn't working out. Maybe I'll try this. If that's you, I'm really glad you're here. Welcome. But there's really two ways we could be looking at this. Are we someone who takes seriously the idea of following Jesus, and do we have the curiosity to continue to seek after him in times of uncertainty? I think that's an important indicator as we kind of introduce and keep talking about this topic. And as followers of Jesus, we order our lives as disciples in three ways. We've looked at the last 3 weeks. We've looked at the first one is to what? Be with Jesus. The second one was to be like Jesus. And the third one was to do as Jesus did. You guys are getting better at that. Good job. Good job. So to be with Jesus, we spend time with him. We spend time in active prayer for one another. We spend time in contemplative prayer. Sometimes you're just walking with him, saying nothing, enjoying the presence of God. What we are doing is we are training our minds and our hearts to default back into his presence. What a medieval writer once said, practicing the presence of God, where every day, every moment of the day, we are with him. He is in our minds and our hearts throughout the entirety of the day. And then to be like Jesus, it means we grow into people of love in Jesus. So we grow into people of love in Jesus. This is an active thing that we do, that we actively look for opportunities to love one another as we grow, and as we flex that muscle, we become more like Jesus. And then last week we looked at doing as Jesus did. The ultimate goal of any apprentice, anyone following, is to eventually do as your master did. And so we looked at the simplicity and the methodologies of Jesus, and how what he did was over a table, eating and drinking with people, and just spending time with those far from God. You know, when we take these things seriously, we really are we're training our bodies, we're training our minds, we're training our lives, we're adjusting and ordering our lives around Jesus. We are formed in a way that becomes a person who permeates Jesus' life and character into the world. This is what it means to be an apprentice, a follower of Jesus, is that we become a person who permeates Jesus' life and character into the world, as any disciple, as any apprentice does with their master. Now, today, I want to kind of turn directions a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about what hinders us from doing this. What's that thing that stops us most often from following this through? Because I think we can all be on board. Yes, I want to be like Jesus. I want to become like him. I want to love like him. I want to spend time with him. I haven't met a single person through this series that says, you know what, Kelly? I don't want that. I think everybody is like, yes, I want that. But there is a huge elephant in the room that often will stop us from doing this, and this is pain and suffering. So it's going to be one of those messages today. I'm sorry. But this is really important topic to talk about when it comes to our formation. When it comes to our formation, the topic of pain and suffering is deeply formative. But what happens when life gets hard as you continue to do this? What happens when it's difficult to do this and life gets difficult? When the follower of Jesus walks into pain and suffering, and here's the reality. We are all living outside of Eden. It sucks out here, right? Like, as much beauty as there is in this world, as we can look at creation and go, wow, there is so much beauty here, there is also a lot of pain. There is a lot of suffering. There is a lot of heartache. There is a lot of discouragement and disappointment that comes with living a reality outside of Eden. In fact, our hope is that Eden will be returning to us, and that's the end of the story. But our time on this planet is short. The Bible calls it like a vapor. You and I are perishing. We are dying. I know we don't necessarily like talking about this. In our view, it's kind of a pessimistic view, but it's a reality, right? We are dying. You and I are both going that direction. It's not a matter of if pain and suffering occur, but when it occurs, and the paradigm to which a follower of Jesus enters into it. And this is what I want to talk about, is the formation that occurs when we enter into the paradigm of pain and suffering. How do we live there? How, as followers of Jesus, do we reconcile this? Because pain and suffering will either sabotage our formation, or it will be the secret to our formation. Think about that as you reflect through this and through your life. Has pain been something, and pain and suffering been something that sabotaged your formation into someone who becomes like Jesus, or has it become the secret to your formation into being someone who looks and acts like Jesus? In fact, one of the most common factors in people losing hope or even giving up on following Jesus is in dealing with pain and suffering. It's the number one factor that causes people to derail off of this journey. We simply have not equipped people, I think in the church in particular, the Big C church, with a paradigm where pain and suffering positively plays in our discipleship and spiritual formation. I just don't think we as leaders have done a very good job of making sure that our people, the church, is equipped to know exactly how to form and to think about this topic. This has resulted in a lot of people feeling lost and abandoned when pain and suffering occurs, leading to a sabotage walk, then a formative walk. When you just are like, the God that I was given, the God I said I would follow, he didn't give me the fine print in this situation in walking through pain and suffering. When we experience deep disappointment, we experience the death of a loved one, chronic illness, emotional abuse of any kind, financial instability, we struggle to see any hope and feel like the last thing that we are doing is growing and maturing. At least that's how I feel. Anybody feel like they're growing when they're struggling? I don't. I feel like I'm going backwards, right? We need to think about how these things form us. Our post-Christian, Western, secular worldview has no good response for this. This is one of the reasons why we struggle, because we don't have a response for this. Tim Keller writes, to kind of paraphrase something Tim Keller wrote, he said, "The Western secular worldview is the least equipped to deal with pain and suffering. How do you find meaning in suffering when you're formed around survival of the fittest? Or when life's purpose is the pursuit of happiness and everything?" Those paradigms don't fit with the reality of this world. And so what happens is we enter into these things as we are culturally developed in our society to think, boy, if I just have all the right stuff, if I'm doing all the right things, if I'm survival, that Darwinian evolutionary survival of the fittest idea, there is no good response to pain and suffering because it's meaningless. In those worldviews, it's at the best, it's just a distraction. At best, it's a distraction. In this paradigm that influences all of us, suffering is an interruption to the meaning of life. Some of us even maybe a permanent blockage to the meaning of life. The emotional and physical sufferings in this life dwell within our bodies when we carry it in perpetuity. We carry it in perpetuity unless we change the paradigm of it being an interruption or meaningless. And if you hear anything today, if you walk away from anything today that I say, I want you to recognize that your pain and sufferings have not been an interruption, even though they may have been an interruption to you, but it won't view it that way. And it for sure is never meaningless. For sure is never meaningless. Pain and suffering has deep meaning. And when worked through in the ways of Jesus, it's significantly formational to our walk with Jesus. You see, pain and suffering is a lot like an eclipse. An eclipse, I was reading a book with some of my guy friends, and we started talking about an eclipse. It's one of the chapters, and I think this is a great image of what pain and suffering can look like. Because if you've never been through an eclipse, and you saw an eclipse occur, you'd be like, this is the end of the world, wouldn't you? Like something's literally blocking out the sun, right? But as people who have been through an eclipse before, you know that this is a momentary thing. You know that the sun, while it's being blocked out and while it looks dark and it looks like it might even be hopeless, animals start going to bed, the days are over, we know that as sure as that darkness covered the sun, so too that moon will cross the sun and there will be light again. And so often when we look at pain and suffering, we sit as if the eclipse will always be there. But there is more to the story. It is not meaningless. It has a purpose. In the present moments of pain and suffering, the time, it feels like it's darkness forever, especially in the present moment. But like an eclipse, we know that those things pass. But we were never going to be the same. And a lot of times that's the case. We're never the same after it passes. But when you take the fear of suffering off the table, when you take the fear of suffering off the table, your life will change. Because we spend so much energy, time, anxiety, and worries trying to do everything we can to stop from pain and suffering occurring. And I'm not saying go search for it, go actively look it out, because just by living, it's going to find you, right? That's a reality. But I am saying that your life will change when the fear of it is taken off the table, when you see it through a different paradigm. We're going to be looking at the story of from James. And James was the Lord's brother and the leader of the church in Jerusalem. He's called the pillar of the early church. And he was someone, as anybody else in this world will know, who understood pain and suffering. The letter that we're going to read parts of today was written around 60 to 65 AD, and if you're a history nerd, you know that this is beginning to be a pivotal part in the first century in the Mediterranean. In Jerusalem at the time of 60, 65 AD, we know that orphans and widows were starving to death. We know this was heavy on James's heart and mind as he writes. As we know that he asked Paul and the other apostles, get money from the Gentiles so they can bring it back to help those who are suffering in Jerusalem. And he is the kind of the leader over this suffering group. And you could imagine the pain that James must have been experiencing here, watching widows and orphans having to starve. Civil strife was boiling over in the city. People were politically in upheavals. There was riots. In 5 short years after writing these, what we're going to read, Jerusalem is completely destroyed by the Romans. In 70 AD, the Romans come through and completely wipe it off the face of the planet. The Colosseum, the Flavian amphitheater that you might go visit in Rome, was built off the money and the sacking of the temple in Jerusalem. It was a terrible time to be in Jerusalem. And in fact, this is also around this time is where James will actually face death himself, as he will be a part of the casualties of the political upheaval in Jerusalem. In this time of desperation and heartache, James writes these words to the church. Let these words settle in. James 1, 2 through 4, he says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." I don't know about you, but when I think about pain and suffering, the last thing I think about is considering it pure joy. That seems like a giant oxymoron in my mind, doesn't it? Consider it pure joy. Well, that word consider is the word hegomai. Say that with me. Hegomai. It's an accounting term. We have any accountants in here? Any number people? Not me. Okay, good. I'm in good company. But it's an accounting term. It means sort out your gains from your losses. Hegomai. Sort out your gains from your losses. So the first thing he says in this time of upheaval and pain and suffering, he says, hey, consider what is of profit, of gain, and what is of loss. In a world where pain and suffering are always seen as loss, James is encouraging his suffering and pain-filled people to count this as profit, to count it as gain. Consider it gain. In the paradigm of pain and suffering as a loss in the value system of God, it doesn't fit. Pain and suffering doesn't fit in the value system of God because God never promises you a life free of pain and suffering. There's not one promise other than on this side of Eden and on this side of eternity will we ever see a life free from pain and suffering. He says no. He actually says the opposite. Jesus says to his disciples, in this world, you will have trouble. You will feel the pressures of this world. You will feel the crunching of this world on your shoulders. But when you value the things God values, in the time of pain and suffering, mainly how it can transform you into a person like Jesus, the suffering servant himself, you will see that as you walk in it with him, and as you enter into the valleys with him, your life has gain more than it is a loss. And how deep that loss may be. This is why when we lament, this kind of religious word lament, all that means is that you are bringing God into your pain and suffering and your sorrow and your circumstances. And you're feeling it with him. And you're feeling it with him. God has a corresponding joy for every trial we find ourselves in. And I know that doesn't always feel that way. I don't know anybody who in the time of pain goes, oh, I can't wait to feel that corresponding joy. I sure never felt that way. But we have to look at the full picture here. He says, this joy that we have, the world did not give it to us, and the world cannot take it away. The circumstances didn't give us this joy, so the circumstances can't take it away. God has a joy that defies our trials. God has a joy that defies our trials. Because one thing we really have to think about as we enter into this topic and we think about formation is that trouble and trial are the rule of this world, not the exception to the rule. I think ease is probably the exception to the rule. I think the difficulties and the trials and the pain and suffering, that is the rule of the world. Ease is the exception. Acceptance of this truth is the first step in healing through pain and suffering and to mature to the joy through it. You know, when you're not expecting pain and suffering, it's a huge interruption. And you just feel like, boy, I got completely derailed by this. But as someone who understands what it's like to live outside of Eden, who knows and expects that this is going to happen, it's not if, but when you enter into it with a different perspective, you go, yeah, absolutely. This is a confirmation of the fallenness of this world, that we do not live in Eden. But it's never meaningless, and it is for sure never wasted. So how? How do we find pure joy in suffering? What is he talking about? What is this oxymoron that we have? Well, joy in the context of James is the context meaning plentiful. It's literally a cup running over. Again, how often do we feel that way in pain and suffering? We're like, oh, my cup runneth over. It's backwards. It's not wasted or meaningless, though. There's something extremely important happening in this moment. It's joy that is found in hope rather than in despair. And I think this is what James is really trying to encourage the church in Jerusalem to understand, is that pain and suffering will sabotage you into despair, or it will be something that grows you and forms you and develops you as a person of hope. As a person of hope. Because hope is about the future, but it's for the present situation. Hope might be something we have in the future, but it's for the present situation. Hope is a powerful tool for us in pain and suffering. Through pain and suffering, trials and troubles, we see joy through the paradigm of Jesus because we're forced to exercise the hope he has given us. This is why it's so important to know how the story ends. This is why it's so important to understand how the promises that God gives, that while our pain and suffering is painful now, in Jesus, it never has the last word. It never gets to define us. It never gets to be that voice that dictates us how we feel about God. In fact, it's something that is a tool that is often used to bring us closer to God. When we sit with him and each other in the expectation of a coming good based on the future promises of God. Again, when this fear of suffering and pain is removed from the table and is replaced with a hope of the promises of God that are coming down the road, how could we ever sit in despair? Despair just means completely done. I can't do this. Whereas hope gives us encouragement of knowing there are better days ahead, even if we don't experience it in the present or in this lifetime. There are better days ahead. The coming good may not be full medical recovery. It may not be a restored relationship, validity from an abuser, or financial recovery. We may not get the coming worldly good that we hope that will solve our problems. But it can grow and mature our faith. And that is a huge thing. Because that means that we're becoming more like Jesus. James says this because he understands the telos, the chief aim of a follower, a disciple of Jesus, is to become like Jesus. That if we are to take this seriously, this way of following Jesus, that we are going to enter into sorrow, we're going to enter into strife, we're going to enter into pain and suffering, because that's exactly what he entered into. He was never spared any of that. In fact, he had it to the extreme degree. So as people who want to follow Jesus, we should expect to follow in those footsteps. This is where the whole, let's be real situation comes into play. Following Jesus will require you to walk through pain and suffering. But it will do something good in you. You know what? A couple of examples I have from my life that I want to encourage you with. Being in church, growing up in church all of my life, I've known really nothing but church since, I grew up in the pews as a baby. Grandma's holding me. That's my life. It's been the church. And I've seen great and beautiful things in the church. I've seen churches functioning very well and blessing and healthy. And I've also seen churches function poorly, very unhealthy and almost to the borderline of toxic. And through those experiences, as tough as some of the pain and suffering was in the context of God's people, right? It has formed me in a way that has a deeper love and appreciation for the God's people. I want to see a church thrive and fellowship and people who follow the Lord Jesus deeply and authentically and transparently, because I've seen the good it can cause. The Tov stuff that we talk about here is a byproduct of my experiences, not of the good, but of the bad. That I have a heart to see a healthy, vibrant, God-fearing, loving each other church, because I've seen the opposite. And I've seen the pain that it causes. That even in my own life, the pain and suffering within a church context has brought about a lot of maturity and goodness. I would not be here without the pain and suffering in the church. Even there were moments when I wanted to give up. There were moments when I was like, this is just too intense. There were so moments when I was so disappointed and discouraged with people that I wanted to not be a part of it. But it was exactly through those moments and holding on to it and holding on to the hope of what could be the church that led me to this, that led me here to you guys. I would not be here without those pain and sufferings. In a way, it matured me. It grew me. But it also sparked a joyous burden of love that we talked about last week for creating an environment and creating a church that properly reflects the goodness of God. Another one, and I don't like talking about this one a lot, but the hardest thing I've gone through probably recently was, again, my niece passing away in a car accident, at 17, and you're just like, okay, God, this makes no sense whatsoever. Why? Why would you do that? Why would this happen? Why would you allow this to happen in our world? I think we've all sat in those moments and go, why, God? Why would you allow this to happen? And you're mad, and you're angry, and you don't get it, you're frustrated. You're looking at the fallout of all of it, and you're like, where is the goodness in this? How are you ever going to use this? I think we've all been there, and in fact, I think that's a good place to be. God can handle your whys. He can handle your frustrations. You're not going to offend him when you question if he's good or not. He is. He can take that. But in a world, how could I ever view death as a gain? How could I ever put that in a win column? How can I ever say, boy, this is good, God? As people would tell me to do. What happened, though, I would never expect, was that through the times I spent with him, through the times I pressed into him on long walks and showers by myself as I'm contemplating and thinking about this and wrestling with it with him in my deepest sorrow, I felt his presence closer than any other time in my entire life. I felt his goodness closer and more often than I ever did in my entire life. And that pain and sorrow, while it will always be there to a point, I don't think you ever just walk out of that. Far greater in my mind now, a few years after this, is how good God met me in it. That is by far the thing that stands out the most through that experience, through all the pain and suffering. The thing that highlights my mind the most as I reflect is how a good God met me in my pain. He didn't leave me. He didn't rebuke me because I was mad at him. He wrapped me up and held me close. And I can say with confidence that that pain and sorrow turned to joyous gain because, again, I grew closer to him. I grew more dependent on him. And if that's not spiritual maturity, I don't know what is. Because you're growing more in humility and love for who he is. So now I can confidently say, with no religious mumbo-jumbo, that I did gain out of a terrible loss. Not in a worldly gain, but because I got to know my God even better. You know, and he talks about perseverance here. He says, because you know the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. You know, perseverance it's just the capacity to hold tight under difficult circumstances, even difficult sermons too. But the capacity to hold tight. You know, James isn't advocating for what's called spiritual bypassing. He's not saying, hey, just don't just ignore it completely, right? And we do this. I've done all of these. You know, someone passes away. You know, you say to someone, oh, don't be sad. They're in a better place now. You should be happy. Don't ever say that to a mourner, right? As good as you're trying to help, that's not helping. I know the intentions are good. Or how about this one? Be happy you're suffering. God will use it. You could walk out of this sermon and be like, hey, look, you're growing. Good job. Suffer away. That's not what James is talking about here. Spiritual bypassing is really just a form of denial, which is the most common way people deal with pain in the short term, and it's highly effective. It's highly effective in the short term to deny the emotions, the feelings, the experiences that you have. Spiritual bypassing, or just a lack of acknowledgement of what happens, is not really addressing the emotion of it. I think as Christians, as people who follow Jesus, a big formational piece of us is being able to wear our emotions a bit on the sleeve and be able to be transparent. Because like I tell my staff, we can only be as transparent as we are honest. Right? You can't have a transparent environment if no one's honest about what's going on. Right? If a death deeply affects you and you do not even think, you just got to be able to talk about all of the emotions that are coming to you just in waves after waves for years and years as it comes. We don't spiritually bypass it and try to cover up. It's like trying to pretty up a pig, right? You have to enter into it and live in it with this idea of bringing God into it with the emotions. You know, the ancient world had a great way of doing this. The ancient world was never in denial about mourning and grief. You know, the ancient Israelites, they had what's called sitting Shiva. You would sit and you would mourn. You would take a mourning period of time. You know, all the way back to even the ancient Romans. You know, they would grow their beards out so people would know, I'm mourning. I think we've lost some of this in our culture. We've kind of tried to cover up or deny that we're hurting or in pain and suffering, when in reality, I think the ancient world had a lot to offer in the sense that we get to recognize it. It's not taboo to be sad or hurting, that you can sit with your pain and sorrow. It's not deny it, but we be open about our emotions, exactly how we're feeling. The other thing that we often do is we detach. We push away from one another instead of find solace in places where we, can find help. In fact, we detach and we try to, deny in different ways. For me, you kind of have to know how you detach. I think we all detach a little bit differently. For me, I like to detach into video games. Anybody else? You just fall into a virtual hole and you're like, reality is not really happening. We detach into different environments. We go into show holes. Maybe you binge watch shows on Netflix all day. You're like, reality is just too hard. I'm going to go live in Grey's Anatomy for a little while. Learn something. I don't know. Is Grey's Anatomy even around anymore? Is that a bad reference? I don't even. But we live focused in distraction rather than our pain. What happens with detachment is we live kind of misguided. We lose focus. It's more kind of almost a form of denial in a different way. And then the biggest one we do is we drug it. We drug our pain and suffering. Now, I'm not talking about the prescription, medicinal stuff that you need. I'm talking about the things where you go the extra too far with. I'm not talking about prescribed medicines that are used responsibly for pain and suffering. I'm talking the excessive usage to say, I'd rather just numb it all up. I had a lady who lost her husband, and she was really into racquetball. And so, she really got into racquetball after he died. It was a good distraction, I think, in some ways, was for her to stay active and going. But, she would go to these racquetball tournaments, and there'd be doctors there, and they knew that her husband had passed. And this would be like just a few weeks after it happened, and they would come up to her and say, hey, I can give you something for that. I can give you something to make you feel better. And she's like, I'm not depressed. I'm mourning. I want to feel it. I want to feel the pain of losing my spouse. She knew that how important it was to not try to numb it up. In fact, so often, I looked at our number one cause of deaths in Eastern Washington is overdoses of fentanyl. Number one killer of anybody under 50 years old. And we have a lot of people who are hurting, and a lot of people who are in pain that need to understand that they're not alone in their pain, that they don't have to numb it, that it's okay to feel it. How many of you guys know it's okay to feel it? I want you to hear that. It's okay to feel it. It's okay to feel the pain. None of these are captured in persevering. Rather than allowing pain and suffering to send you into denial, detachment, or drugs, perseverance is found in understanding that your suffering isn't going to be wasted. That your suffering isn't going to be wasted, and that the Lord is using it to build you up. That once the eclipse passes, you will have a deeper appreciation and knowledge of who he is when you incorporate him in it. This is the way of Jesus. This is the way of Jesus. You think about probably his darkest moment of suffering, beyond the cross, even besides the physical pain, was the emotional pain of preparing for it. When he goes into that Garden of Gethsemane, he falls on his knees. His best friends fall asleep on him because they don't understand what's going on. That makes me feel better as a disciple because I have no idea what's going on half the time, right? He goes into the garden, he falls on his knees, and he has a full-blown panic attack. Jesus has a full-blown panic attack because he knows what's about to occur and he doesn't want to do it. He says, God, take this cup from me. Father, I don't want to do this. And I don't blame him. I wouldn't want to do it either. And he suffers, and he's sorrowful, and he's praying for hours and hours on end, trying to get through this. And finally, he comes up with the resolve of not your will, but mine. But not my will, but your will be done. And the resolve that comes through the pain and sorrow is a resolve that ends up bringing the completion of the mission, which was the death and resurrection on a cross. Nothing is ever wasted. Your pain and suffering was never meaningless. The loss that you experienced in this world will not go wasted. It can and will be used to build you up to be people like Jesus. Look what Hebrews 12, 1 through 2 says. Again, Hebrews written in the context of a hopeless and despaired people. The persecution was so intense to the people who are the original audience of Hebrews that the writer is just trying to keep them to hold on for a little bit longer. Hold on for a little bit longer. And this is what they says. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. That Jesus is going to develop your faith. He's going to author it through the hard and difficult times, the troubles of this world. He is going to complete us as a mimic of his joy through our troubles, but we have to persevere. We have to hold tight. We have to endure the race set before us. We got to cling to him, because you're going to cling to something. Make sure you're clinging to him. Make sure you're clinging to something that is not going to be temporary or perishable, but you're clinging on to him. As we stand firm with him, persevering in the pain and suffering through the trouble, we are built up, we are made stronger, we are brought more into maturity, and what that word there is wholeness. The thing that was meant to destroy you, the thing that was meant to bring despair, the thing that was meant to discourage you completely off of the following of Jesus is the thing that's going to mature you. This is the thing that's actually going to bring you wholeness. It is so backwards, but it is the way the kingdom of God is made. Because the kingdom of God is made up of people who have endured pain and suffering, who aren't afraid of it, who see it as a reality, but they also see the effects of it in the fact that it can build up, equip, and mature. What Jesus does for us is something modern thinkers are just now learning about in the realm of trauma treatment. There was a psychologist who studied the effects of trauma and recovery, and their hypothesis was, well, depending on the severity of the trauma, there will be a different kind of recovery period of time. And so that was their hypothesis, right? So they picked some of the most heinous, traumatic experiences that people could offer, and they sat down with them. And guess what? Their hypothesis was completely wrong. There was zero change in the severity of trauma when patients all had one thing in common. The ones that made emotional recoveries all had safe places to talk and process their pain, regardless of the type of pain and suffering they occurred. Get that? The ones that made the recovery were the ones that had safe places to talk and process their pain, regardless of the type of pain and suffering. That it was that they knew the places they could go. They had community they could go to. And I think hopefully some of them had a good God they could go to. Our Lord called you to follow him so that he could be a refuge for you to talk and process your pain with. In fact, this is a craving of God. He wants to be there for you. He may not have been the cause of your pain and suffering, but he for sure is the answer to it. Where what happened to you wasn't meaningless, he will be used to bring you into wholeness and maturity. That he wants to bring maturity, completeness, and wholeness to you in your time. Where you weren't left in despair, but given hope for the future in the present. A hope is a powerful muscle that we flex as followers of Jesus, that we need in the present for the sake of the future. To persevere in pain and suffering, we need each other. For it to be worked out for our good, conforming us into the image of Jesus, our Lord, we need him. So as we work these things out together, as psychologists are just starting to figure out that we need one another, something that I think the Bible's known since its beginning. We need one another. And then what happens is God transforms us into people who are like him. The way of Jesus is not a life free of pain and suffering, but a life where God meets us in it, transforming us by it. Transforming us by it. One thing, I'll end with this. A blessing of this church, I think, is just in the diversity of our people. I think church is easy to write off or dismiss our cloud of witnesses who are here in this room. And I'm thinking about our older people. I didn't have really an eloquent way to say that. But I am extremely grateful for those with gray hair in this room. Because guess what? You know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about when it means for life to take more than it is to give, because you're walking in it. You've seen it, you've experienced it, and you're still here. Churches need older groups. They need the elders of churches. I'm not talking about the position of elder. I'm talking about those who are further along in the road, who have experienced pain and suffering, have seen the other side of it. That they can be a cloud of witnesses as well. It's not just those who have gone beyond, but those who are in this room. And in church, oftentimes, we kind of cherish the young and the youthful. I'm pretty sure that's why they hired me. I was just young, youthful, Aspire. But really, what we should really be cherishing are those people who have some gray hairs on their head. Some of those people who have gone through the pain and suffering of this world, have understood, again, what it means to lose rather than to receive, and have persevered through it. I think of my grandmas. I think of my Mimi and Nani, who's probably watching this from California, the losses that they've experienced with spouses and friends and siblings and those types of things, where life does get to a point where it takes more than it gives. And those people are persevering machines. Those are the people that we should be talking to, listening to. If you're a younger person, you don't have a friend who has some gray hairs on their head, find one, because you are going to find encouragement. You are going to learn what it means to persevere because of their stories. Pain and suffering can either sabotage our formation, or it can be the secret to it. How do you view your past sufferings or the ones you're in now? As you reflect on this, how do you view your current situation? If you're in financial instability, do you think about this is a time to exercise God's providence? Instead of all the anxieties and worries of where you're going to get your next paycheck from, what if you just took a moment to think, is God big enough to provide for me? We deal with loss every single day. We've all lost people in this room. Do we think about what kind of emotions that comes to mind that we need to release to God? Things that we may have been holding on for years, bitterness, maybe some anger. But then we think about, how did we grow closer to Him? How do we grow closer to Him in those times? Have you just had a conversation with Him where you just yell at Him for 5 minutes because there's just so much pent up in there? And I promise you, He can take it. You're not going to offend Him by being mad at Him. But in it, we find hope. And that's the important thing. In it, we find hope. We find the joy of maturity and wholeness. We find a deeper transformation into the likeness of our Lord, which is why this is so crucial to how we become disciples. Because we're not only disciples when we want to be, we're disciples in the pain and the suffering. We're disciples that grow into maturity in the hardest times of our lives. And I'll end with this, as Paul will write in Romans 8, God works out all things for good for those who love Him and are called according to His purposes. And the good there, that good thing that he's talking about is that we are conformed into the image of His Son, Jesus Christ. So what's that thing for you? What's your thing? And how is He going to turn that into someone in you who reflects Jesus Christ?